right, let's go back. What are we doing? The difficulties of securing adequate wages led to a black labor movement. This step was undertaken by two black leaders, Congressman Jeff Long and State Representative H.M. Turner. Their purpose was to organize a union among black people, demanding a minimum wage of $30 a month for field hands and $15 for women. The convention received a considerable notice, and the employers condemned it. There were strikes in Macon and Daughtry County. In Houston County, there was agitation, and county associations of field hands were attempted. But this movement for rural unions was not very successful. Georgia was thus a state where a coalition of planters and black people began before Reconstruction. But while the planters advised black people and made fair promises, they took no active part with them. When the new political life began, the planters and the poor whites combined to put black people out of the legislation. The carpetbaggers and scallywags formed a moderate bloc and fought with the planters to gain control of the poor whites. In this way, they succeeded and were able to ignore black people, bribe white laborers with silence, and make commerce and business triumph in the state. The carpetbaggers and scallywags went money extravagantly, but they spent it and their printing and contingent funds with southern merchants and supplied houses, thus combining capitalistic interests. Georgia does not present the stock picture of the state looted by outsiders. It looted itself. Reviewing the events recorded from the beginning of this chapter, we observe that the period of Reconstruction in Georgia was not a period when a swarm of harpies took possession of the state government and preyed at will upon the helpless people. Preyed at will upon the helpless people. The Constitutional Convention of 1867 and 1868 forbade such a period, but when the conservative roused themselves from that time on the stage presents the internecine war between two very well matched enemies. This struggle is usually represented as between a wicked assailant and a righteous assailed. It was a struggle between Republicans and Democrats is much more characteristic. In such a contest, mutual vilifying, of course, abounded, and it is not to be supposed a priori that the vilifying of one party was more truthful than that of the other. None were proud of the extravagance that accompanied this building of the commercial states than white Georgians. They welcomed the bearers of Northern capital, then as now. The most extraordinary man in the Reconstruction history of Georgia was Hannibal I. Campbell, who was a capitalist interest in railroads and often associated for the business purposes with ex-Governor Brown. He was especially close to Governor Bullock and was a focus on bribery and corruption. He was a type of a class of inspiring Northern men who was rushed to the South since the war. Some to run plantations, some to open mines in coal and iron, some to build railroads, others to establish great hotels, and all to give a grand impulse of Southern progress and show the, quote, old fogies in the South how to do it. Many of these enterprising men have already come to grief and left the country, while others are in full career to fortune or her eldest daughter misfortune. Campbell, hey, hello. Campbell has been, of course, represented as a bribing black person. But what Campbell and his kind bribed was the city of Atlanta, the state of Georgia, and the whole South. And while he doubtless gave his 10 and hundreds to black legislator, his thousands and tens of thousands went to that vast majority of white men who saw him and his method the salvation of a new capitalistic South, and who made the wealth and advertising of Atlanta overshadow the old-fashioned conservatism of Savannah and Macon. However, Georgia was not ruled by carpetbaggers. In fact, facts do not warrant the description of the Reconstruction government of Georgia as a black carpetbagger combination. There were some of both classes in the Constitutional Convention and in the legislature in 1868, already mentioned, and many in the federal service, particularly as internal revenue officers, but they generally held minor positions. The planter candidates for governor who opposed Bullock's testified that in 1970, not more than a dozen former non-residents were holding office in Georgia, and at the judges appointed by Bullock were entirely satisfactory. The economic boom of Georgia was evident. The value of total property rose steadily from 191 million in 1868 to 234 million in 1871. By 1870, the cotton crop of Georgia had surpassed the largest crop raised under slavery, a proof that black labor had not been demoralized by emancipation. Manufactures increased during 1860 to 1870, and the lumber business greatly increased. There had been 643 million miles of railroad in 1850 and 1,420 in 1860. By 1870, this had increased to 1,845 miles and 2,160 in 1872. This business and industrial prosperity of Georgia was largely at the expense of the laboring classes. The educational system was started, but it received little support. Instead of preventing crime, crime was deliberately increased by the convict leasing system. The poor, the blind, and the wild were neglected. And although peasant farmers, because of the high price of produce, were able to buy some land, there was no effort to place large numbers of small owners in their own farms. There was no real labor legislation. On the other hand, capital began to receive large returns, and speculation was rife. It is the special interest to note that in Georgia, where the native white men never lost control, there was particularly the same increase in debt and the same railway scandals. There was graft in printing, advertising, and attorney fees, and the state debt was greatly increasing, so that included endorsed railroad bonds. It reached a total liability of over $20 million in 1872. Hey, look, it's back to one. It may be gathered from this that extravagance and theft in this Reconstruction South was a matter neither of race nor geography. Rather, it was a question of poverty, opportunity, and current American morals. Nevertheless, there were in Georgia the same charges of theft and waste as elsewhere, and the same final desire to shoulder the blame on black people. In the election of December 1870, there was a large Democratic majority in both houses of the legislature, and the Democrats continued in power. Bullock, foreseeing impeachment, resigned in October 1871. The legislature met in November. In December, there were several investigating committees. Robert Tomes became prosecuting attorney, and the investigation were thoroughly partisan. Railroad manipulation in Georgia, as elsewhere, led to Wall Street and many financiers of New York, like Henry Clues, a company, and Russell Sage. The act granted aid to railroads, quote, were passed by votes of members of both political parties, and the state is considered secure against loss if the law be properly enforced. The lease of the state-owned railroads undoubtedly involved corruption, but among the lessees were former Governor Brown, Alexander Stephens, and Ben Hill, in addition to H.I. Campbell and others. Naturally, no black people were involved except as possible recipients of bribes. Representative Turner seemed to have worked hard to secure more reasonable terms, payment only after the work was actually finished. Bullock himself was charged with many financial frauds, but none of them were ever proven. His worst deed, the establishment of the convict leasing system, was not held against him but adopted by the state with avidity. Florida had long been a refuge for runaway slaves, and the desire to reclaim these slaves had led to the so-called Seminole Wars of the final annexation. There were 27,943 whites and 26,534 black people in 1840. The first census after the state entered the Union in 1860 there were 77,746 whites, and 62,677 black people. There never were as many as 1,000 free black people in the state before emancipation. Florida was a poor state with a small population. It had been dominated by rich planters, and the poor whites had little opportunity. The state, therefore, in many respects resembles North Carolina rather than Alabama, in that the black man was the dominant labor and not white proletariat ever ruled. On the other hand, black labor never came to self-assertion, while planters and carpetbaggers manipulated it from the first and gerrymandered its representation. White rule was ever in control, but it was only partially proletarian in character. Although there were hundreds of black soldiers in the state at the time of Johnson's proclamation, he ordered a convention based on white suffrage, and the convention made October 2nd, 1865. It was composed almost entirely of Confederates, and the message of the provisional government. Marvin gave them encouragement. It was doubtful if there was any noticeable opinion among the whites in favor of black suffrage. Certainly, Marvin spoke decidedly against it. Quote, "It does not appear to me that the public good of the state or the nation at large would be promoted by conferring at the present time upon the freemen the elective franchise. Neither the white people nor the people of color were prepared for so radical a change in their social relations, nor have I any reason to believe that any considerable number of the freemen desire to possess this privilege." The convention finally said, "Hey, look, I got one person, yay!" All right. The convention said, "The people of the state of Florida, in general conventions, assembly, do ordain and declare that while we recognize the freedom of people of color race and are desirous to extend to them full protection, we declare it the unalterable sentiment of this convention that the laws of the state shall be made and executed by the white race." The convention sat 12 days and adjourned for the ensuing election. E.C. Walker was elected governor. He recommended the removal of black soldiers from the state and advocated various black laws. He said, with regard to black suffrage, "Each one of us knows that we could not give either an honest or a conscientious assent to black suffrage. There is not one of us that would not feel that he was doing wrong in bartering his self-respect his conscience and his duty to his country, and to the Union itself, for the benefits he might hope to obtain by getting back into the Union. A commission of 3 was appointed to report laws concerning the black people. They recommended a county criminal court, mainly for black offenders, and the same discrimination against emancipated slaves which had been used formerly against free black people. They were not sure how they could keep black people at work, and they were tearful concerning his future. And this is the quote: "If after all their honest efforts shall prove unavailing, and this 4 million of the human family, but recently dragged up from barbarism, and through the influence of Southern masters elevated to the status of Christian men and women, shall be doomed by the inscrutable behest of the mysterious providence to follow in the footsteps of the fast fading aboriginals," they used a bad word, "of this continent, and when the last man of the race shall be standing upon the crumbling brink of the people's graves, it will be some compensation to the descendants of the Southern masters to catch the grateful and benignant recognition of this representative man, as he points with his withering finger to the author of his ruin and exclaims, 'Thou doest it.'" The black laws of Florida followed, quote, "the same to save them from ruin which inevitably awaits them if left to be to the tender mercies of the chanting hypocrisy of the Mackwish sentimentally, which is participated them to the realization of their present condition," end quote. There were the usual vagrancies and apprenticeship laws against firearms. On the other hand, there were laws regarding marriage and the right to testify in court but only in matters which black people were concerned. After the federal law of June 21st, 1866, a large number of black people flocked to Florida. From 1865 to 1867, the chief thought of the freedom of Florida, as in other states, concerning itself with what the government was doing to do for them with regard to farms, and they were victims of many speculators. The duel in Florida for the control of labor was between 2 sets of northern men, mostly federal office holders of various sorts, and the planters. The policy of the planters was so to shift their influence between the northerners so as to gain their ends by political strategy, which they finally did. At the same time, they made some effective efforts to keep in touch with black people so that they retained a good deal of influence over their vote. When the election of 1876 under the Reconstruction laws were about to take place, black people sought to get in touch with leading white Southerners. One meeting was held in Leon County, and several white planters invited to address it and gave black people information as to their newly acquired duties as citizens. This increased the rivalry between the planters and the carpetbaggers, with the results that the planters made few further open efforts to cooperate with the black vote. The Southern whites tried to kill the convention by refraining from voting, so that the total votes cast was 14,503, of which all but 1,220 was cast by black people. The convention of 1968, 46 delegates were returned. 18 of these were black people. Of the 27 whites, 2 were conservatives, 15 carpetbaggers, and the rest Southern whites. The most cultured member of the convention probably was Jonathan Gibbs, a black person. Gibbs was a tall and slightly built black with a high forehead and a color indicating biracial origins. His voice was clear and ringing. He possessed some of the qualities of the born orators and a genuine sentimentalist. E. Fortunes, another member of color, was a native of Florida with a fair education, courageous in his opinions. Among other leaders of color were Armstrong, Oates, and Wallace, who wrote the history of Reconstruction in Florida. The convention, which met January 20th, 1968, had men of color of Tallahassee. C.H. Pierce, a temporary president. He was not a strong man and was later convicted of technical bribery, but on the whole his advice and efforts seemed to have been sincere, and he had the confidence of a large number of people of color. Of the 68 delegates, there were only 20 present. Richard, a white man of Illinois, who, as Wallace says, had been only 2 days in the county from which he had been returned, was elected permanent chairman. Richards, however, struck the right note in his speech. He said, "We should provide for a system by which all may obtain homes of their own, and a comfortable living, and also provide for schools in which all may be educated free of expense, clothe honest industries with respectability, inaugurate a public sentiment that shall crown the man with honors as a benefactor of his race, who makes 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before and prohibit all laws that are not equal, just to all within our state." The first difficulties, it's just 2 of us, hope you're all having fun. The first difficulty was a matter of money. There was only $500 in the treasury, and the convention had to issue script to pay its expenses. This script calculated at less than per value and made the expenses appear much larger than they actually were. 2 factions earlier developed among the carpetbaggers, and the policy of the planters was to wait and take advantage from time to time of the outcome of this internal fight. This left black people in a peculiar helpless condition, and it was only the ability of the sanctity of men like Gibbs that enabled them to make any headway at all. On the second day of the convention, an ordinance was passed forbidding the sale of property for debt, suspending the collection of taxes, releasing all persons held in labor for non-payment of taxes, but not forbidding the laborer the right to collect wages for his employer. It was distinctly legislation in the interest of labor. The convention had been in session of about 2 weeks when the planters took a hand. The 2 factions among the northern white leaders were the conservative Osborne faction, which leaned towards the planters, and the more radical Bills faction, which sought complete control of black people. The Osborne faction and the planters, under the leadership of ex-Governor Walker, succeeded in breaking up the convention so that nearly half of it seceded and went off secretly to the neighboring town to work on a constitution. This rump convention adopted a constitution and sent it to the federal general of the district for his approval. They then took a recess. Afterwards, they returned to Tallahassee, broke into the legislative hall at midnight, and declared themselves the rightful convention. General Meade intervened and made the 2 factions come together and adopt the Constitution, which proved to be mainly the Constitution drawn by the seceders. This Constitution was a particular document. It put vast appointment power in the hands of the governor, making him a practical dictator of the state. And it was also charged that the basis of representation was so unfair that less than 1/4 of the registered voters would elect a majority of the state Senate and less than 1/3 of majority of the assembly. Jeez, it's only us 2. 6,700 voters of the rebel counties elected as many senators as 20,282 voters elect in Union counties. 7 senators are elected by 3,027 voters in rebel counties, and only 1 senator is elected by 3,181 in Union County, Leon, and 23 voters elected 1 senator in the rebel district. In the assembly, 8,330 voters in rebel counties chose 27 members. Madison County Union, with 1,802 voters, sent 2 representatives, while the rebels sent from Dade County has a contingency of 8 registered voters. This was accomplished by discriminating against the localities where the black vote was large, so that black people never had in the legislators a representation anywhere near as large as their population called for. The Constitution revealed the former Confederates from taking the registration oath. Charles Sumner and others opposed the emissions of the state under this Constitution, but nevertheless, after a delay from February to June, the state was amended. In the election on the Constitution, the other state officers, Billings was the candidate of the radical branch of the Northern white leaders, and the planters nominated a Confederate cavalry colonel, but in reality threw their support to Harrison Reed. The candidates of the Osborne faction, which had made the Constitution, the Republican ticket headed by Reed received 14,421 votes. The Democratic ticket headed by Scott, 7,731, and the Independent Radical ticket, 2,251. In the first legislature, there was 17 Republicans and 8 Democrats in the Senate, and 36 Republicans and 15 Democrats in the House. Of these, 19 were black people, 13 carpetbaggers, 21 Southern Loyalists, and 23 conservatives. Harrison Reed was a Johnson Democrat and formerly chief postal agent in Florida. He was present at Johnson's inauguration as an unofficial representative of the state and was a strong component of Chase. He was a curious character, like Warmoth of Louisiana. He was an horrid politician and was repeatedly threatened with impeachment. But he was not as unscrupulous a grifter as Warmoth and exercised his great power with considerable care. His policies always was to favor the planters as much as possible, and then when black people or northern whites revolted, to yield to them sufficiently so as to retain their support. In his cabinet, the more important place went to ex-slave holders. A number of black members in subsequent Florida legislature is not clear. Wallace mentioned 25 members of people of color members of the House on the legislature of 1873. The number of representatives in the legislature who could neither read nor write during the 7 years of carpetbag rule in Florida was 6, and of whom 4 were white. Under the Constitution, and the governor appointed all the chief states officers except the lieutenant governor and judges, and also he named most of the county officers. Nevertheless, the Constitution of 1869 gave black people the right to vote and gave Florida its first approach to a real government of the people. Reed's administration started out with strength and respectability, but it was weak because the lack of recognition of people of color. His opponents therefore tried one method of attacking him, from introducing a civil rights bill compelling hotel keepers and railroad companies to receive black people on the same terms as whites. The bill was passed in the assembly, but the governor called in members of the Senate and explained why he thought it was not wise to push such legislation. People of color became alarmed, but through Pierce and other leaders, their apprehension were allied. The ill will against Reed began when electors were chosen in November 1868. Impeachment proceedings against him were begun, but the Supreme Court ruled that there was no quorum in the Senate at the time. The Secretary of State, Adeline, had joined in the opposition to Reed and was removed. Gibbs, a leader of color, was selected as his successor, which greatly increased the strength of Reed among the freedmen. The ensuing turmoil in Florida cannot be understood unless one keeps carefully in mind just what was taking place. The planters were encouraging lawlessness and inciting black people to make extravagant demands for equality in order to embarrass the carpetbaggers and excite the poor whites. The carpetbaggers and northern capitalists were seeking to get rid of Reed and bribing white and black members of the legislature in order to get through special legislations for capital. Black people were trying to find a program of labor legislation which would help to uplift the masses. Reed was playing capital labor and planters against each other. And in the midst of these contradictory and opposing forces, the state staggered on. The governor informed the legislature that the past 7 years of anarchy and insurrection had left nothing in the treasury, with $600,000 of debt and in large amounts repudiated. The former inadequate school funds had been robbed of its last dollars to aid the Confederate forces. The railroad system, half completed, was bankrupt. The revenue laws inadequate. No schools or school systems. No benevolent institutions. No almshouses, penitentiaries, and secrecy of jail. A jail. Scarcely a jail. There you go. That's better. Hey, everybody. Welcome there. The first Reconstruction legislation, black leaders, Harmon and Black tried to pass a law. Harmon and Black tried to pass a school law for the education of the masses. At the second session of the legislature, a homestead law was passed and the school laws amended. Acts of violence throughout the state continued, and there was considerable bribery in the legislature. Okay. The second session of the legislature met January 5th, 1869. There was a second attempt to impeach Reed, foiled by the action of two members of color, H.H. Harmon and E. Fortune, and finally defeated by the vote of 35-5. An extraordinary session of the legislature was called May 17th, 1869, on the account of financial difficulties, matters connected with the sales of Pensacola and Georgia Railroad and Tallahassee Railroad. Railroad legislation was introduced. Littlefield and Sweepson, already operating in North Carolina, being connected with the matter. State aid was asked at the rate of $12,000 a mile for these railroads, which would amount to $4 million. Wallace says that members of the legislature were openly bought. White men received from $2,000 to $6,000, and men of color $500 or less. There were disturbances in various counties and open violence and bloodshed in 1868 to 1869. Reed was asked to declare martial law, but instead he sent Secretary Gibbs to the centers of disturbance. Gibbs received close attention from the people of color and openly attacked the carpetbagger leaders. The legislature met in January 1870. It is the third regular session. The governor repeated the statement which he had made before. In several counties, organized bands and lawless men have combined to override the civil authorities, and many acts of violence have occurred. But these have been incidental to the state, and in all its past history, arise less perhaps from special enmity to the present form of government than from opposition to the restraints of the law in general. It is true that these same localities, being to all intents border sections, have from time immemorial been the resort of lawless and reckless men, and in some of them, as early as in earlier periods of the existence of the western and southwestern states, the law of Judge Lynch and the regulators for years before the war had been the only code of much of efficacy. I had hoped better results from the reorganization of government under the Republican auspices, but the bitterness resulting from the war, the noxious teachings of the disappointed and defeated political opponents, arrested by the occasional lack of discretion on the part of the injudicious political friends, succeeding for a long time in a setting at naught the advice and the effort of the better men of all classes, until improvement at times seems to be hopeless. And I have been strongly and forcibly urged to the declaration of martial law. Again, an attempt was made to impeach Reed, but members of color stood by him. The impeachment committee sent in 2 reports, a majority report signed by 4 and a minority report signed by 1. The minority report, which was adopted, said, looking back over the history of the state for the last 10 years, so full of excitement, agitation, and turmoil, we are profoundly impressed with the sense of the value of the results of the reconstructive legislation and the national government, and its subsequent result in organization of our own state of government. We feel bound in duty to call attention to many difficulties and embarrassments, particularly of the financial description, with which in the administration of a newly organized government, Governor Reed was found himself continually surrounded, without sympathy, with sanctity resources, without the support from the portions of his cabinet, and as it appears from the testimony and from official documents, called to fill the magnitude of offices by the appointment of imperative strangers. He must have been seriously embarrassed and hampered on every hand. After deliberate consideration of the charges, the evidence, the surrounding and difficult circumstances, and in view of the results that may be expected to follow the actions taken, we do not find the charges preferred to be so far sustained by the evidence given as to warrant us in recommending an impeachment. The report was adopted by a vote of 27 to 22. All the members of color of the legislature except 1 vote against impeachment. Oh, I don't know who Magic Man is. In 1870, the Democratic Party put the nomination Bloxham for lieutenant governor. The Republican politicians declared that if Bloxham was elected, they would unite with the Democrats so as to impeach Governor Reed and make Bloxham governor. Wallace thinks that Bloxham was the fact elected, but counted out by the returning board, of which Gibson, the Secretary of Color of the state, the person of color Secretary of State, was a member. He says that Gibbs consented with great reluctance, and under threat of impeachment, he did not yield. It must be remembered, however, that Bloxham was a friend of the mentor of Wallace and edited his book. The legislature met in January 1872 and again sought to impeach the governor. The more ignorant of the members of the assembly were secured to vote for the impeachment. The southern counties judge was promised appointment as a circuit judge, and the Democratic members of the assembly was promised to share of the new bonds Ex-Governor Walker promised the support of the Democrats. The governor, in his message, complained that more than 2/3 of the bonds issued in aid of Littlefield roads have been wasted without any real progress. The bonds were entrusted to firms and swindlers in New York. Impeachment proceedings were based on this, and the governor was suspended from office, but the trial was never held, and at an extra session of the legislature, he was restored to office. Sorry. There had been much corruption in every legislator under Reed, but Wallace said, quote, "The members of color, as this session began to show more manhood by openly denouncing the tricks of the carpetbaggers and refusing to be enslaved by the caucus rule, Caucasians, I guess," end quote. They showed their independence by this resolution, introducing by Daniel McInnes, person of color of Duval County. Hereas it appears that after several attempts to have a civil rights bill, which gives to every citizen the same protection and enjoyment of his liberties, and whereas it has become a painful fact from the actions of liberty, billing acting President pro tem of the Senate and the state of Florida, and others who were opposed to seeing citizens of color of the state enjoy the same rights that he and his associates do, we again witness on today another defeat in the civil rights bill caused by only those who profess to be our friends in connection with this great cause of the civil rights. Therefore, resolve that we, members of color, and those who honestly sympathize with us, do unhesitantly repudiate such friendships and do now and henceforth withdraw from the decline from ever affiliating with politically or to aid in electing any such man or men who have been baselessly misrepresented our people. These resolutions were ruled out of order. McInnes was fought and denounced in his county and lost the next election up to the legislature although, quote, one of the most faithful and honest representatives, person of color, people. The delegation elected Leon County, all people of color, stood opposed to the system of plunder, which had been inaugurated in almost every county of the state. This was shown when Gleason introduced a bill to authorize cooperation, to change their names and consolidate their capital stock, etc. The measure was adopted by the Republican caucus, but when the matter came up for final consideration, the Leon County delegates opposed the bill, and John W. Watt, a black person, made a speech which was the first order spread in the minutes of the legislature in Florida. We want Tom Scott. We want no Tom Scott, Jim Fisk, and Vanderbilts to this state to govern us, by means of which they would influence legislation tending to advance personal interests. The great curse of Florida has been dishonest cooperation, rings and cliques, with the eye single to their central interest. And if this bill is suffered to pass as this assembly, in my opinion, we may look for a continuation of abuse and a usurpation of the rights of citizens who be opposed to a evil machination such as are generally exerted by consolidated bodies. The recent expose the Tammany Ring in New York. This has satisfied all right-thinking men that the power exercised by strong bodies composed of many corporations, corporation is the most dangerous to the public good and safety. Therefore, it becomes us to pass a bill enveloped in darkness, as the title of this bill indicates it to be. At last attempt was made in this session to impeach Reed. Wallace says, as one of the members of the committee, I never saw the report of the investigating committee, nor any other evidence upon which the subsequent articles of impeachment presented by the committee were based. After a long and intricate fight, Reed, supported loyally by his Secretary of State Gibbs, out generaled his opponent. However, Reed was not renominated. Although people of color wanted him, the planters who felt strong enough to assert themselves and secure the section as Republican candidates for governor of Justice, O.B. Hart, the carpetbaggers, filled the rest of the ticket, except that the freemen received recognition by the nomination of J.T. Walls as one of the candidates for United States representative. The campaign was better, and the results of the elections closed. The Republicans carried it by a small margin. Hart was the first native governor of Florida in Reconstruction times, but was a vacillating and uncertain man. The legislature met in January 1873 and nominated a man of color, Scott, for speaker. He was defeated by the revolt of the people of color delegation from Leon County on account of his connection with politicians. In return, the white leaders insisted that no man of color was fit for a cabinet position except Jonathan C. Gibbs, and they charged, had attempted to count in Bloxham in a previous election. Black people insisted on Gibbs. Hart refused until members of color in caucus demanded Gibbs' appointment, with the threat that they would otherwise combine with the Democrats and clog the wheel of the administration. Members of color of both branches of the legislature went to Hart in a body, and finally he had to accede to their demands. Gibbs was appointed superintendent of public instruction. Gibbs held this office during 1872 to 1874, when the school system was tottering and the collection of funds difficult. He virtually established the public schools of the state as an orderly system. But when the students of Florida history recently tried to examine the records of his administration, he discovered that they had all disappeared from the state archives. The extraordinary political complication of the day are illustrated by Hart and his cabinet. Hart was a Southern planter backed by carpetbaggers, and his Secretary of State was Wallace McLean. Wallace says, "Hey, look, someone else is here. It's getting better. The cabinet was a very fair one with the exception of McLean, who was a dissenter from the rebel army, and being self-condemned for his own treachery, for having volunteered in the Confederate service, and then deserted before he smelled gunpowder. He was satisfied with that neither the Democrats nor the carpetbaggers cared to trust him, and he was therefore the tool of the most rabid and unprincipled members of the carpetbag dynasty of the state." Hello, Ellie. Hello. In 1873, Gibbs and the trustees of the Agricultural College frustrated an attempt to invest the $100,000 received from the general government in bonds, which would have put the cash in possession of the politicians. When Hart died in 1874, Stearns became governor. He wanted to ask the resignation of Gibbs, but Gibbs was too popular. Stearns was promised to nominate Gibbs for Congress, but was afraid that he would not control him. Gibbs was in perfect health before the meeting of the convention, and during its sitting, he delivered a powerful speech in the Stearns Convention, attacking one of his supporters. He went home and ate a hearty dinner, after which he suddenly died. Quote, it was whispered and generally believed that he was poisoned by some of the carpetbaggers because they dreaded his growing popularity. His brother, Judge Mulfin Gibbs of Arkansas, gave a different cause for his death, but notes his fear of assassination. My brother Jonathan C. Gibbs was then the Secretary of State of Florida, with Governor Hart as the executive. He had the benefit of a collegiate education, having graduated from Dartmouth, New Hampshire, and had for some years filled the pulpit as a Presbyterian minister. The stress of Reconstruction is obviously necessity for ability in secular manners induced him to enter official life. Naturally, indomitable, he more than fulfilled the expectation of his friends and supporters by his rare ability as a thinker and a speaker with unflinching fidelity of his party principles. I found him at Tallahassee, the capital, in a well-appointed residence, but his sleeping place in the attic resembled as previous considerable an arsenal. He said that for the better advantage, it had been his resting place for several months of his life. He had been threatened by the Triple K. It was my last interview or sight of my brother. Subsequently, after the 3-hour speech, he went to his office and suddenly died of apoplexy. Apoplexy. I can't say the word. Let me find out. It won't let me say that. Sudden stroke or hemorrhage. Apoplexy. I can't say it anymore. All right. In the legislator, so they said that he died of a sudden stroke hemorrhage into the organs, especially the brain, causing loss, consciousness, paralysis, or death. So in the legislature in 1873, there were 25 members of color, of whom 19 were in revolt against the political leader. The methods of the white politicians were illustrated in the case of 2 members of color who wished to inspect the state prison. Everything was done to impede them. A special train was prepared for the comfort and the visiting guests, but it left just 2 hours before the time designated, and the men of color were left behind. But black people were energetic and determined and reached the grounds by other means. The warden at once set out liquor and cigars, but the men of color refused to partake and went about their investigation. The Civil Rights Bill finally passed at this session without great opposition. A matter of land distribution continued to come up, and the northern politicians assured the freemen that they favored high taxes upon the land and the ex-slaveholders, so as to compel them to sell these lands cheaply. On the other hand, they accused the planters of being in favor of low taxes, so that the whites could hold the land and rent it to people of color. This propaganda influenced black votes to result in no real action. In the legislature of 1875, most of the minor offices were filled with men of color. The Republican State Convention renominated Stearns for governor and adopted a platform haranguing both state and national governments for corruption, extravagance, and oppression. The state debt was only $1,329,757.68. The state taxation, which had been less than 2 mills on the dollar in 1861, had increased to 5 mil in 1867 and 13 7/10 mil in 1872. It was then reduced to 7 mil in 1875, and expenditures were but $190,000 against receipts of about $220,000. Thus, the Democratic cries of extravagance, it was not particularly effective. In the campaign of 1876, the Democrats won. McLean, the ex-Confederate in the cabinet, celebrated in Tallahassee Sentinel the victory of Hayes. In general, Florida presents no abnormal picture. There was some waste of high taxation, but it did not reach extremes. It had, as in other states, to contend with deliberate efforts to sabotage the advance. The Floridian said in 1871, no greater calamity could befall on the state of Florida while under the rule of its present carpetbag scallywag officials than to be placed in good financial credit. Our only hope is that the state utter financial bankruptcy and haven grant that may speedily come. On the other hand, establish for the state financial credit on Wall Street so that Florida bonds can be sold by Reed and Company as fast as issued, and you give these foul harpies a life tenure of these offices. The temporal salvation of the taxpayer is having scrape low, so that they can buy it to pay taxes with, and in having the state financial Reddit low so that Reed and Company can't sell state bonds so as to raise money with which to perpetuate their hold on office. There was bribery of black legislators, as Wallace frankly shows, but he also says of his history, the design of this work is to correct and settle the erroneous expressions that has gone out to the world, that the former slaves, when enfranchised, had no conception of good government, and therefore their chief ambition was corruption and plunder. It was white men and not men of color who originated corruption and enriched themselves from the earnings of the people of the state from the year 1868 to 1877. That the loss of the Senate to the National Republican Party was not due to any unfaithfulness of people of color to that party, but to the corruption of these strange white leaders, termed carpetbaggers, that the people of color have done as well as any other people could have done under the same circumstances, if not better. Wallace particularly laments that the effort of corrupt leaders on black people. The Northern machine politicians assert that it was the incompetence and unfaithfulness of black voters to the Republican Party that brought about the unhealthy conditions of things which made the Solid South. It was these and kindred acts of the carpetbaggers which furnished the key to unlock the doors that reveals the secrets of the Solid South. While these very carpetbaggers were sustained by the Northern machine politicians from the beginning to the end of Stern's so-called administration, it was contaminated with packed juries for political purposes. And during the last 2 years of his term, it became a patent fact that scarcely a person brought before the court in the Black Belt counties could be convicted from the fact that the petite jurors were mostly composed of the very worst elements among the freemen. This is not the whole truth. The reactionary planters in whom Wallace and other people of color men pathetically believed were not honest and sincere in their advice to the support of black people. They encouraged lawlessness among poor whites, extravagance among carpetbaggers, and bribery among black people. They deliberately befouled the whole political nest in order to discredit its rulers and voters. Shall I sing of liberty when there is no liberty? Shall I sing of freedom when there is none? Shall I sing love songs to young lovers who are slaves? My soul thrills even as I think the laburnum, I can't say this, laburnum, the springtime thrills to link her chain of gold. I am lost to the great miracle which nature has endlessly wrought out of freedom. But man sits amid his own ruins, eating husks. Charles Eskerin Scott Wood. And that's the end of that chapter, everybody. Whoever's here still. Got 5 people, thank God. Chapter 8. The duel of labor control and bordered and frontier. So I wonder what we're going to talk about here. How's everybody doing? Everybody doing all right? Doing well? Yeah, you're here. Didn't have a lot of people here. How in North Carolina and Virginia, in the border states and on the southwestern frontier, the dominant white worker after the war sealed the fate of his fellow black laborer. North Carolina presents quite a different situation. A method of Reconstruction from the state studied. The war left the state in economic bankruptcy. The repudiation of the Confederate debt closed every bank, and farm property was reduced in value 1/3. The male population was greatly reduced, and the masses were in distress. In the 1800s, North Carolina had 337,764 whites and 140,339 black people in 1840. 484,870 whites and 268,549 black people. In the 1800s, there were 629,942 whites and 361,544 black people. There was 30,000 free black people in 1860, and a class who had in the past received some consideration. Until 1835, they had the right to vote and had voted intelligently. In the 19th century, one of the best schools in the state for children of the white aristocracy was conducted by John Chavis, a black person educated at Princeton. Many black people had come into the state during the war, so that their proportion of the population increased in 1870 to 1880. In general, however, emancipation was not attended by any great disorders, and the general tide of domestic life flowed on. The Freedmen's Bureau issued rations to white people as well as people of color, and many were kept from starvation. Large sums of money were received from the North in 1866 to 1867. The grain and provisions as well. When President Johnson called North Carolina whites into consultation concerning his proposal plan of Reconstruction, many of them were highly indignant, some even leaving the room. They did not propose to share power even with the president, but wanted to put their own legislator back in power. They finally acquiesced, and William H. Holden was appointed provisional governor. May 29th, he ordered an election for the convention with the white electorate. September 21st. By June 27th, 1,921 pardons had been granted in North Carolina, 510 of which came under the $20,000 exemption. Here, as in another state, there came a preliminary movement of planters to secure control of the black vote. Alfred M. Waddell, in July 1865, editor of the Herald, before the war, and a colonel in the Confederate Army, spoke to people of color in Wilmington and denounced taxation without representation. He advocated the extension of the suffrage to qualified black people. The Sentinel said it was opposed to black voting, but would open its pages for discussion. Favorable articles appeared by Victor C. Beringer and David L. Swant. The idea was forestalled any attempt for northern white leaders and capitalists to control the black vote. The black people, however, had thought that leadership, both from the free black people class, who had some education, from immigrants of color from the North, many of whom had been born in North Carolina, had escaped from slavery. During the year 1865, black people circulated petitions asking for President for equal rights. The Convention of 1865 met October 2nd. The Ordinance of Secession was repudiated and slavery abolished, but no action at first was taken on the Confederate debt. Johnson interfered, and at last the debt was formally repudiated. Although the leading papers of the state called the action humiliating, the General Assembly met in November when the 13th Amendment was ratified. But the vote explained that this amendment would not give Congress power to legislate on the civil and political status of the free men. A commission was appointed to report a new legislation for the free men. This commission reported in 1866, and the General Assembly passed a bill which defined black people and gave them the civil rights that free black people had before the war. The apprenticeship law, disposing of young black people preferably to their former masters and mistress, was passed, and black people could be witnessed only in the case in which black people were involved. In 1867, there were acts to prevent inciting servants, harboring them, breach of contract, and later seditious language and insurrection. The adjourned session of the convention in May made a significant change in the basis of representation. Formerly, 3/5 of black people had been counted in the representation, but the new Constitution changed the basis of the white population along and allowed only white persons to vote or hold office. During the state convention, black people had met in Wrangell and adopted a set of resolutions which, quote, asked in moderate and well-chosen language that the race might have protection and an opportunity for education. They also asked that discrimination before the law be abolished. They said nothing about the suffrage. In the fall election of 1866, Worth was chosen governor. He advocated the rejection of the 14th Amendment. The legislature agreed. Helden, the former provisional governor and now leader of the Republicans, changed his attitude towards black suffrage, and in December 1866 openly advocated votes for black people. Holden says, the people of North Carolina had rejected President Johnson's plan of Reconstruction on the white basis. They had also rejected the Howard Amendment, under which they could have returned to the Union as Tennessee did. Nearly 3 years from the close of hostilities had elapsed, and we were still under provisional forms, with the national military paramount. What was to be done in the conversation? What is there to be done in a conversation which had with Thaddeus Stevens in December 1866? He told me he thought it would be best for the South to remain 10 years longer under military rule, and that during this time we would have territorial governors and territorial legislators, and the government of Washington would pay our general expenses as territories and educate our children, white and people of color. It did not want that state of things in North Carolina. It did not want to run the risk of a practical confiscation of our property to pay the expenses which have been entailed upon us by these military governments. It did not want North Carolina to cease to exist as a state. I confess I fear confiscation of property to the greatest and less extent, especially as President Johnson has said to me in May 1865, I intend to confiscate the lands of these rich men who I have excluded from pardon by my proclamation, and divide the proceeds thereof among the families of the wool hat boys, the Confederate soldiers whom these men forced into battle to protect their property and slaves. When Reconstruction Act was under consideration in Congress, the North Carolina black people sent a delegation to Washington asking for the removal of Worth and that Holden be relieved of his disabilities so that he could again be put in office. In September 1867, after the Reconstruction Act had passed, black leaders called another convention in Raleigh. Can't say the name. Among these leaders, as James H. Harrison, born in North Carolina, but educated in Ohio, even the whites acknowledged that, quote, he had a great ability. Another leader was James Walker Hood, born in Pennsylvania. Thank you. Raleigh, and sent south as a missionary by the African Zion Church. He became eventually a leading official in the organization of public schools in North Carolina, and finally was elected bishop in his church. Other black leaders were A. H. Galloway, Isham Sweet, and J.W. Ward. Was Regal's convention asked for full rights and full protections and the abolition of all discrimination before the law. They especially demanded ample means of opportunity for education. The convention resolved itself into the Equal Rights League and established a newspaper. I'm tired of burping. The order of the general registration was published in May 1867, and the registration was to begin in July in 170 registration districts. In the appointment of the boards, Governor Worth wanted to avoid the appointment of black people, but recommended a few. For the general board, G.W. Brody, a person of color minister from the North, was selected by General Sickles. There were 106,721 whites who registered and 72,932 black people. 93,006 votes were the Constitutional Convention, and 32,996, all of them white, voted against the Constitution, and the Constitution was ratified April 21st, 1868, by the vote of 93,084 against 74,015. In the registration, 19 counties had black majority, and in several other counties, the white majority was less than 100. Immediately, there was an attempt to organize political parties. A People's Convention met March 27th with white and black delegates. It was denounced by the planters as a meeting of, quote, Holden's I gotta look up this word, everybody. Hopefully it'll let me say it. MESCEGENAT. Oh my gosh, I hate this thing. Hold on. ISC. There we go. Oh wait, is that it? No. Let's just keep going. E-G-E. Oh, it's not going to say it. Come on. Miscegenationist. Hold on, I got to hear it. Here's what it says. Miscegenation. I can't say it, it's too hard. All right, what does that mean? What does it mean? We're going to find out what it means. Which means a formal, often derogatory term for the marriage, cohabitation, or sexual relations between individuals of different races. Ooh. Wow. The people of color delegates took a prominent part and made many speeches, and the Republican Party was organized. On the other hand, an attempt was made in Raleigh to call a mass of people of color meeting at which Governor Roarth and other conservatives were to speak. The idea evidently began being to divide the black vote between the parties, but the conservatives did not respond. Among people of color there was growing a strong feeling about the land. Some wanted the land confiscated and given to small farmers, but many of the northern capitalists opposed this. Harris advocated taxation of large estates so that the land could be sold and opportunity given to black people to buy. On the other hand, he wanted the disabilities of the planters removed. While most of his followers were opposed to this, the election was held in November 1867, and the result in a large majority of the convention, although over 50,000 people, mostly whites, did not vote. On January 14th, 1868, the Constitutional Convention of the Congressional Plan convened in Raleigh. Of 133 members of the body, 18 were Northern carpetbaggers and 15 were black people. The leading carpetbagger were H.L. Grant of Rhode Island and the Reverend C.C. Ashley of Massachusetts. Afterward, the superintendent of public instruction, the Reverend James Walker Hood of Pennsylvania, was the outstanding black delegate. The Reverend Ashley was made chairman of the Committee of Education, and from this position he greatly influenced the educational provision of the Constitution of 1868, and the leading black member were James H. Harris, J.W. Ward, J.W. Hood, and A.H. Galloway. The next year, Hood was made an agent of the Bureau of Education, and there he did his life work. In the convention, the chief matters of discussion were segregation in schools, intermarriage, and propositions concerning holding of state offices by black people. The record of the proceedings of the convention adhered strictly to parliamentary form. There were no speeches by any of the members of the convention recorded. The Constitution, which was adopted had the Bill of Rights, in which men were declared equal, slavery prohibited, and people's rights to education asserted. Property qualification for office were abolished, and universal suffrage and a system of public schools ordered to be established. There were also provisions for vagrants and penitentiary, public charities, and orphanages. The convention wrangled over the question of separate schools for black people, and finally refused to make separation of race in schools compulsory. They discussed intermarriage and universal suffrage. There was a proposition to get loans for Congress from agricultural purposes and buying land and homes. This was declared to be paid for black people for their long labor without rewards for their services during the war. Loans from $3 million to $10 million were proposed. The convention passed 75 ordinances and 56 resolutions and sat for 55 days. The reception of this constitution and the work of the convention was characteristic The planters' press in the state was strong, and it insulted the convention in every way possible. The real brunt of the attack, however, fell not on black people, but on northern capitalist leaders. The Republican Standard called the convention one of the, quote, the ablest, most dignified, and most patriotic bodies that ever assembled in the state. The reactionary Sentinel called it, quote, the so-called Convention of, quote, Ethiopian Ministries. Oh, ministries, ministerials. Ham radicalism in its glory. Some said that the pillars of the Capitol should be hung in the morning for the murder sovereignty of North Carolina. And Joshua Turner, who was the chief credit for finally overthrowing Reconstruction in North Carolina, said in the legislative halls, where once giants sat, are adventurers, Menkins, and gibbering, oh my gosh, Africans. Oh, my bad. The North Carolinians, February 11th, 1868, said the Cowles Museum contains, oh my gosh, I'm not using these. They're all animals and other jackasses. Okay. Evidently, the state, by the combination of northern capitalists and black people, and by the corresponding refusal of the whites to cooperate, was passing under the new regime. In the convention of the carpetbaggers had large influences in the committee, and when the state was organized, they undertook to run it upon a large scale, spending more money, certainly in parts for the reason that the state had more things to do. As for the assistance, public education, internal improvements, and extensions of the credit of the state in public improvements. Public improvements. Public improvements. Public improvements. Public improvements. Self with the carpetbaggers. The conservatives fought the Constitution on the grounds that it made black people a social equal. And while it gave representation to black people, it did not give representation to property. The Wilmington, for instance, it was said that black people cast the majority of votes, that 39 forfeits. Ooh, what's that word? Yeah, look at this word. Where'd it go? Where'd you go? There you are. Come on. Thank you. F-O. I don't know why my phone won't let me, sometimes it won't let me, it won't say the word.
40th.
Oh, 40th. Okay, 40th. 9/40ths of the real estimate belonging to white people. Property was thus arrayed against labor, while labor was allied with the new carpetbag capital. The new capital was in the hands of persons who had but lately come to the state. In no state was the fight of planters against carpetbaggers more bitter. All right, hold on a second. I'm going to put a 585. Just real quick. I'm going to look ahead. 585, everybody. I don't think there's any stopping points, honestly. Nope. Nope. Yeah, we don't get it long ahead. So we're going to have to find a stopping point sometime soon. Okay. Due to the long presence of the Army in the state during the war, with the easy communication by water, a large number of Northerners after the war chose North Carolina as a likely home to place for work and investment. Holden summoned the legislature to meet January 1st, 1868. In his inaugural address, he defended the carpetbaggers and stated that in the history of the state, most of the leaders had come from the outside. The legislature ratified the 14th Amendment and voted down the provisions to separate black schools. There were 3 black members of the Senate out of the total of 15, and 16 members of the House out of the total of 120. 2 of the black people acted as speakers of various times. At various times, among both black and white members, there was considerable illiteracy, and among the local officials throughout the states, it was said that few of the black appointees were competent, and many were competent, and many of the whites were not. I mean, dang! All right. The real fight in North Carolina was between the old regime and the white carpetbaggers, with the poor whites as ultimate arbitrators and black labor between, struggling for existence. The brunt of the attack was the northern newcomers, the combination by which the white immigrants gained control of the state with the support of black people had to meet, as in all southern states, a charge of extravagance and if not corruptions. During the 2 years of the government of Holden, the debt of North Carolina was increased from $16 million to $32 million. It is doubtful, however, if Holden could be held responsible for this, and certainly that black people could not. Most of this debt was to aid railroads. The aid granted to railroads by the Convention of 1868 and the legislature of 1868 to 1869, quote, was generally approved and passed by votes of members of both parties, end quote. The object was to extend and complete the general railroad system, and popular belief was that immigration and consequent development would justify the improvement and secure the states against loss. These exceptions have been disappointed. Immigration was checked and prevented. Part of the bonds were sold as a sacrifice, and the proceeds misapplied by the officers of the companies. Among the men managing the railroads, converting the proceeds were members of both political parties. The planters who bore the taxation raged with cries and fraud and theft. And the Sentinel said, rave on, ye radical plunderers, but our days of inequity and fraud and corruption are fast coming to an end. The people insulted the robbed will not much longer suffer you to pursue your foul practices and elude public justice. The North Carolina served, loved and honored by Gadsden, Hash, Badger, Swan, and Ruffin, is the same North Carolina no more. She is now the hog-through of the Union, where Littlefield, DeWessy, Laughlin, Torgee, Houghton, Ashley, Brewer, Abbott, and such swines come to swallow with native hogs like Holden, Victor, and Greasy Sam's. Many, and we're getting there. I'm gonna try to finish this page up. Many things show that in North Carolina, land and capital were biting for black and white labor vote. Capital with universal suffrage outbid the landed interest. The landholders had one recourse, and that was to draw the color line and convince the native-born whites voters that his interests lay with the planter class, were opposed to those of the North interlopers and black people. The boycott on the part of the planters against black labor, unless it voted right, was severe. When the legislature of 1868 adjourned, 88 of the Republican members signed a bitter address to the people, which was militant labor strike back. And here's what they said. Did it occur to you, ye gentlemen, of property, education, and character, to you, ye men, and especially ye women, who never received anything from these people of color, but services, kindness, and protection? Did it ever occur to you that these same people who are so very bad will not be willing to sleep in the cold when our houses are denied them, merely because they will not vote as you do, that they may not be willing to starve, while they are willing to work for bread? Did it never occur to you that the revenge, which is sweet to you, may be sweet to them? Hear us. If nothing else, you will hear. Did it never occur to you that if you kill our children with hunger, they will kill your children with fear? Did it ever occur to you that if you good people maliciously determine that they shall have no shelter, they may determine that you shall have no shelter? And now be it remembered that in the late elections, there were more than 20,000 majority of freemen of North Carolina who voted in opposition to the Democratic Party. It will be safer for the landholders, householders, and meat holders to attempt to kick into disgrace and starve to death 20,000 majority of the free men of the state. Again, later, as the power of the planters became stronger, the standard representing the carpetbaggers said, "Can there be any remedy under the forms of law? We think so, unquestionably. Of course, it is not to be supposed that men and women and children will starve to death, while corn is still standing in the fields, and while hogs and cattle are not kept under lock and key. But these are matters in minor importance and are to be expected, however much the necessity may be deplored. What we mean is that there is one efficient remedy for this wholesale crusade of oppression carried on against the people of color race, to starve him into voting against his choice. The remedy is this: whenever the Republican can have control of the county, let a meeting of the commissioners be called at once. Let them make out a list of all people of color stonemasons, bricklayers, plasterers, painters, and carpenters. Then let them select a site of sufficient dimensions for the village of from 5 to 1,500 people of color paupers, as the case may be. The work itself will give employment to a considerable number of persons, and some time will be required to complete it. Let the county paupers be moved in to be provided with houses and food, that the expenses of those who have made them paupers. Let the tax be so laid as to affect only a large landholders. Not one in 20 owns any land at all, and the large landholders are much rarer. This tax will fall lightly upon the great mass of the people, while the oppressive landholders will be compelled to throw his broad acres upon the market and raise money to pay the taxes. And in addition to this, let the legislator deprive these enacting tyrants and benefit to stay law and compel them to pay their debts, to pass their lands under the sheriff hammer, and give the poor a chance to buy land. Hold on a second. I think. Let me see here. Yeah, it's going to go to. I'm going to stop right here. Governor Holder was accused. Let's just see that. We'll start there tomorrow. So again, doing the bad deeds to manipulating black leaders, making them so they have so much less representation of black people that they don't get anything passed for them. 587. This is in Georgia. These are all the states that they're going through with particular conditions and how they they addressed the black vote, black suffrage, black existence and recognition, honestly. Yeah, black resistance. All right. Right. All right, then. Well, I don't think anybody's coming up. I appreciate everybody coming in and listening to me read. I hope people get something out of it when I read. If not, at least people will have someone that I think my reading is good enough that maybe some people can, I know you can't. I think that maybe some people can actually listen to me reading and I can be one of the voices that people can just read through. But yeah. All right, everybody. Well, I'm going to close out. Thank you. Have a good day.